I'm Andy Weir, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Andy Weir.
It's episode 260 of the Author Stories Podcast. Find all of the archives of the show at hankgarner.com. If you find some episodes that you like in the archives, would you do me a favor and share those with your friends, family, and loved ones? I would really appreciate that. I hope you enjoy all of the great shows that we bring you, and the reason we're able to bring you such great content is because of our sponsors, and I would like to thank some of those sponsors. If you would like to sponsor the show and highlight your product or service to our audience, go to hankgarner.com, and there's a link in the menu there at the top that says advertise, and you can highlight your product or service to our audience. Nick Breaker's book Essence, Book 1 Septima, one of the best science fiction writers I know. Nick Breaker weaves some of the best science fiction adventure stories you'll ever read. Essence, Book 1 Septima is a must-read. Go pick it up today. There's a link to it in the show notes. Third Scribe is the place for authors and readers to meet. Go to thirdscribe.com. You can set up an account for free, and you can link up with some of your favorite authors and find out what's going on with them. Authors, you need to have a place where you can highlight your books to your audience. Thirdscribe.com is built especially around books, linking people that love books with people that write books. Go visit them today. Thirdscribe.com. Tell Robin the folks that I sent you. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. Episode 20 just dropped today. It is amazing, with stories by Jess West, Rhett Bruno, Eamon Ambrose, Bob Williams. Tales is my favorite monthly publication. Go pick it up today and get that old pulp goodness feeling. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned, episode number 20, out right now. Also, don't forget, we're highlighting Tales of Dystopia this week, and we've got a special interview show with some of the authors from it, but Chronicle World's Tales of Dystopia, 13 stories of animals and humans interacting at the end of the world. This project also benefits Pets for Vets, one of the most outstanding charities out there, linking up rescue animals with veterans that need some companionship. So go pick up a copy of Chronicle World's Tales of Dystopia. It's only 99 cents while it launches. At the end of the show, don't forget we have an audiobook clip from Richard Cleaves, the Jason Crane series.
Hey everybody, it's Josh Hayes, and I'm here with Chuck Manley and Scott Moon. We are Keystroke Medium, and this is the Keystroke Medium Minute. Hey, it's Josh. I'm here with Chuck and Scott, and today for the Keystroke Medium Minute, we're talking about writing more than one book in a series before publishing. There's been a lot of different ways to kind of get into the indie market. It used to be that you could write some serials and publish those serials individually, and then at the end of those serials, when you got it all wrapped up, publish an omnibus. Hugh Howey did it. Michael Bunker did it. Lots of people did that when we were first starting out, and that seemed to be the trend 3 or 4 years ago. And I think now we're kind of seeing a change in that trend, in that to hit those 30, 60, 90-day cliffs that are really set hard in the Amazon algorithms, to do that, to get the most bang for your buck, as it were. A lot of authors are championing the idea of writing the first 3 novels in a series and then publishing them every 30 or 60 days, and that will start an upward trend for Amazon and show that your rank and your book will pick up and go. I have not done this myself. I should have, but that's what I'm going to do once I get to my own standalone series. And Chuck, you mentioned that you had never done this before. So what are you?
No, but I tell you, I see the wisdom in it, and I see the wisdom in it more from just a Amazon algorithm standpoint. Let's say, I tend to write and think in trilogies. So let's say I write the first book in a series, I put that book up there, and it's for sale. Well, let's say I get to the beginning of book 3 and I've written something in book 1 that I wish I hadn't written that somehow changes the story. I can't really easily go back and tweak that to make it match. If I've got all 3 books written, I can make sure that those stories flow seamlessly across the entire trilogy before I release it. So I find the idea of this attractive both from a creative and a business standpoint. And even though I haven't done it, I have a series in mind. I think I might try it with at some point in the future.
This paradigm of production is directly contrary to how traditionally published books worked, 5 or 10 years ago, because they were like, a traditional publishing house would say, write us 1 book. If you produce, we'll carry on. We're not going to invest all this time and money in you. So a key aspect of this is you have to be able to write fairly quickly. And that doesn't mean like Chris Fox fast or some of these other people who write so fast, but you got to be putting in the work and getting it done. So like, I really don't have anything more to say on this. Josh and Chuck covered it all. So I wanted to talk about my fictional book that hasn't been written, but we'll just call it Omelets in Space. So that was a jab. That's one of our shows. So, but if I wrote a book called Omelets in Space, then I might want to, come up with the, book 2 ham and beans and, whatever, until I had all 3 books, and then I could launch them, every 30 to 60 days to keep, so the readers, because everybody has that series where you're like, I'm tired of waiting 3 years for the next Game of Thrones book or whatever.
Well, it's interesting. It's a good point to make, because I say this and I bring this type of publishing up for a brand new author, and you can do it as an established author, but it's probably harder to do it as an established author than it is to do as a brand new author. And what I mean by that is, if you're, say, a George R.R. Martin or Richard Fox or whoever that has an already built-in fan base, you already have that expectation. So you're not going to save all these books while you're writing them. You got to get them out there. But if nobody knows who you are and nobody knows the Omelet in Space books, nobody knows who those are, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you published the first one. As
brilliant as Omelets in Space would be, there's a lot of other books out there, and if I write Omelets in Space 1 and it doesn't catch on, and then I wait too long, they may not come back. I might have people who really liked it, but they've moved on with their lives and found some other books,
Yeah.
And another bacon-based books.
Yeah. Another thing to realize, too, is if you go through the write them and then release them method, when you get to book 3, hash brown casserole, you can actually drop book 3 and simultaneously drop a box set for those people that have been waiting for the complete series. So that would actually be a kind of a marketing move as well.
We should end this one with this is easier said than done.
Definitely easier said than done. Definitely not for everybody.
Definitely.
And as with everything on the Keystroke Media Minutes, all these things are things that we've learned through our interviews and learned through doing it ourselves. But they're definitely not the only way to do it.
Absolutely.
We just have seen this process and this method work very well and make authors a lot of money. So definitely don't take it as the end all be all. But if you have the option to try it, I definitely recommend at least trying it at least one time.
Yeah, and keep your eyes open for Scott Moon's new series, The Interstellar Breakfast Bar.
Right. Shenanigans.
Okay, well, this has been Josh for Chuck and Scott. Thanks for listening to this Keystroke Minute. You can find more of our show at keystrokemedium.com, where we have author interviews and craft discussion and a lot of shenanigans. Come out and hang out with us.
Shenanigans.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Andy Weir back on the show. Andy first appeared on episode 50, and as we are recording this episode, episode 250 dropped yesterday. So it's been a while, and Andy has a lot of stuff that's happened in the interim, and looking forward to catching up. Welcome back to the show, Andy.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Yeah. So Andy,
You didn't learn your lesson the first time.
I didn't.
I mean, kind of like, how a dog returns to its own vomit. You're kind of coming back to me.
Yeah, I'm hard-headed that way. That's what my wife says anyway. So, anyway, the last time we talked, the book, had just kind of gone nuclear and had taken on this life of its own, and there was this movie and there was a lot of hype around the movie, and the movie came out, did phenomenally well, and I can only imagine kind of what your life has been like since then. What's been going on since August of 2015 when we talked last?
Well, I got a bunch of money and I moved to a bigger house.
I'm trying not to spit my coffee.
Yeah. Moved to a bigger stuff, and in the intervening time, I've been working on my next novel. So work-wise, I mean, yeah. So and actually, so as I'm sure we will mention somewhere, my next novel is called Artemis. But between The Martian and Artemis, I worked on a different book called Zhek, Z-H-E-K, and I worked on that for about a year. I got 70,000 words into it before I decided this is not a good book.
Oh, man.
And I shelved it. And I think it's one of those shelves, like the shelves way in the back of your refrigerator where you're just waiting for the food to rot so you can throw it away without guilt. However, I will probably steal elements. There are some. I feel like Jack has some really cool ideas in it.
Right.
It's just it just as a story it wasn't working. So I may steal some of those ideas for future stories. So I'll keep it for parts. But yeah. But I realized it was not going anywhere. The only thing you can do as a writer is say like, oh hey. You want to write a book that you yourself would enjoy reading. Exactly. And I would not enjoy reading that. So I asked the publisher if it'd be okay, and they said yes, for me to hit the big red reset button and work on a completely different project. So they extended my deadline by a year, and I wrote Artemis.
Nice.
And I'm so much happier with Artemis. I really feel like it was the right decision. It was a painful decision.
Oh, I can imagine. I can imagine. Yeah. You are you have a really interesting story with the publication of The Martian, and we won't rehash that. That story's been told. Yeah. But one of the interesting things is that people think that was your first foray into writing, but you had been writing for a long time, and The Martian was this organic thing that you began on your website, and this was not your first thing that you had written. It was the first thing that, kind of went viral that hit.
Technically it was the second thing that went viral. The first thing was my short story, The Egg.
Right.
But, yeah.
Right. For
the record, sir.
But I think a lot of people would kind of, wonder, oh, will Andy's, gonna hit his sophomore slump, and maybe kind of file Zhek that way. But that was not. That was, sometimes that just happens. Whether, I would imagine that the pressure to follow up The Martian was intense, but you were not exactly green at this. So talk a little bit about what that, the pressure was like when you have something that goes so massive, like The Martian. And do you, I would imagine you can't not think about it. But how do you compartmentalize that so that you can, stay creative?
Well, I just kind of have to set realistic expectations. I mean, I know that The Martian was a bizarre success that was like lightning in a bottle kind of thing. The thing that a writer will get once in an entire career if he's lucky. So I have to realize that The Martian is probably going to be my high point, right? And so
that's okay.
And that's okay. I started strong right out of the gate. So that's probably going to be the case with The Martian. So for Artemis, I just want to shoot for, look, did you like the book? That's what I'm going for, is like, say, like, I want to establish myself as a real author. I want to grow a little bit. The characters in Artemis have more depth than the ones in The Martian. There's more complexity in the plot. And also, if people read Artemis and say, like, it wasn't as good as The Martian, but it was still really good, then I'll call that a win. I just kind of like, it's too bad that, since it, follows up The Martian and The Martian is my only other book, literally every single review is going to compare it to The Martian.
Yeah, and I can only imagine. But that's what happens. When people love something so much, I guess that's a good problem to have.
It's a good problem to have, but at the same time, if people go into Artemis with expectations of like, oh man, it's The Martian was my favorite book of all time, so now this one surely will be my next favorite book of all time, then that's kind of a hard expectation to meet. But I think it's really good. I don't think I left anything on the table. I'm very happy with how it turned out, and it's not like, oh well, this is the best I can do. I think it's a really good story. And so the real question is, in a parallel dimension where I'd never written The Martian, would Artemis be something that made people sit up and take notice of me as an author? And I don't know the answer to that because I don't have one of those handy devices that goes to other dimensions, but I hope that it is. How's that?
But you feel good about it. Like this was the story that was in you to tell. So
yeah, I feel great about it for a couple of reasons. First off, I think it's, like I said before, I stretched myself. I made deeper characters, more complex plots. I got to do my thing with the hard sci-fi and the realism and all that. And I also put a lot of effort into economic realism, like why do you have a city on the moon? Like, that sort of stuff. And also, unlike The Martian, this one sets itself up to be... could very easily be a series or a bunch of books that all take place in the same setting, whereas The Martian is like, okay, he's home, we're done.
Right.
Sorry, spoiler.
No, dang it. Before we, and I really want to dig into kind of your creative process around Artemis and that book that got shelved in the middle. But I've never had Matt Damon make a movie out of one of my books. So
you haven't?
Yeah, not yet. But what was that feeling like when you got to see it on the big screen? And I thought the movie was phenomenal. It was not the book. It was pretty close to the book.
Yeah.
But they left out some things, and I know you probably get this all the time. Some things that we loved about the book. They just had to take out for time, and things like that. But were you happy with the way it turned out? And is there anything you would have done different about that process?
Oh, I think they did just such a fantastic job on the film. I mean, I could not be happier. Of course, they had to take things out for runtime. If they put everything that was in the book into the movie, it'd be a 6-hour movie. So
exactly.
you have to get rid of some stuff. But the stuff they took out is, if they had left it up to me, they did not. I had no authority at all. But if it had been my decision, I would have taken out the same things. There were like events and elements in his survival that were not directly salient to the main plot. Like they could be removed without affecting the rest of the story significantly. And Drew Goddard, who wrote the screenplay, did an excellent job at finding those things and then lifting them out without screwing up the rest of the story. The only thing that I would change, if I were king, is I hate that they took out the Aquaman joke.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, come on, man. It's the Aquaman joke. That's one of my favorite moments.
Right.
So,
you couldn't have given 30 seconds for the Aquaman joke?
Yeah,
really?
just, throw some Aquaman joke in there. That's okay. They put it in the extra materials, but they didn't have it in the main.
It was fantastic. My wife and I went on. my wife and I went on opening day, and I just sat there going, man, this is everything I hoped it would be.
They did just such a great job. And boy, I tell you, no one can do sweeping, gorgeous landscapes like Ridley Scott. And that was something that the movie really improved upon in the book, because in the book there's only so long you can describe hills. It's just not that interesting to give a verbal description of landscape and scenery. But it's like in the book there's this constant Mars imagery, and you're there, and it's just so beautiful.
Yeah, it's so immersive. You really feel like you're there.
Yeah.
So when did you start working on the shelved book?
Jack.
Yeah, Jack. When did you start working on that?
I was actually working on chapters of Jack before I even finished The Martian. At the time, I was, I had no idea The Martian was going to hit so big, and at the time, this was just my hobby, and so I would post. I was making serials on my website, and Jack was one of the serials along with The Martian. And so after The Martian was finished, I figured, now I'll keep working on Jack. But unlike The Martian, which kind of ran in a straight line in a very logical sequence of events that led to the end, Jack just started to really wander. And once I once I had an editor, once it became a contract with Random House and my editor started looking at it, he started pointing out, very correctly pointing out, okay, this is a problem. You've got this. You're 70,000 words in for those listeners out in podcast land. The Martian, the whole book is 100,000 words. You're 70,000 words in. You're still in the first act. I mean, this is going to be some 800-page tome, and there are these meandering plot lines. Too many characters, not enough focus. And he was nice about how he pointed that stuff out. My editor is great. Julian Pavia is his name. But he's like, look, these are serious problems that you've got to solve. And I'm like, you're right. And I tried to solve them. I went back. I worked on it for a year, but ultimately I'm like, this story is flawed.
Yeah, at 70,000 words, you should start thinking about, landing the third act and
or the second,
right? Or, setting up for some sort of ending. Yeah. Oh man. So you did have the input of someone else. You weren't just, this wasn't a decision that you just, one day sat down to write more of the story and said, I'm just fed up with this. I can't do it anymore.
Correct. And I was starting to think it wasn't working for a while. And then over time I got convinced. I'm like, I don't think this is working. I talked to my editor and floated the idea. How would you feel about a reset? And he said, well, I'd want to know what you had, to follow it, And so he's like, yeah, we can do this if you want, but we're going to want to know what it is that you have in mind next. And so I actually had two different book ideas that I was equally enthusiastic about, one of which was Artemis and the other which I will probably write in the future. And I presented them both. I actually wrote chapter 1 of each story, and everybody liked Artemis more. So,
do you feel like you had more leeway and grace with your publisher because The Martian was such a massive hit?
Oh, God, yes. Oh, yeah. I tried not to abuse it. That's why I was very apologetic and stuff with the reset button and stuff like that. But, yeah, I'm sure they put up with a lot more from me than they would have from a new author.
What is your daily process? How has it changed since you are able to do this full time now? And you used to have a serious job, a real job, and then would come
opposed to this
exactly as opposed to this writer stuff, now. Right? and you would come home and write for fun. When you get to do it full time, and not only get to do it full time, but get to do it in a new house and all of that full time. How does that change your daily process and your daily habit?
Well, I have to have a lot of discipline because I'm sitting in front of my computer, which has an internet connection, and so it's really easy to just screw around. So I have to have a lot of discipline. So I try to make some rules for myself. Like say, I set myself a goal, usually 1,000 words a day. And I have a bunch of self-enforced rules of things I'm not allowed to do until I've finished my words for the day. So not allowed to watch video entertainment of any kind. like neither TV nor YouTube nor videos online. That sort of stuff. There are certain websites that I can really sink a lot of hours into just by screwing around on them. I'm not allowed to go to those, and so on. That helps. But for the most part, I just have to kind of like really just nose to the grindstone, just like any other job. You got to just push through even when you don't want to.
People make fun of George R.R. Martin for writing on a DOS machine with WordStar 4, but there's a real reason for that. The connected world is very seductive.
Cable,
well,
right?
Yeah,
and go ahead and use Word.
Yeah, it's a seductive thing. The connected world. It's crazy.
It's so easy.
It is. So you're 70,000 words into Zhek, and it's just not working. And when you the idea for Artemis, like how much time did you give yourself, when you hit the reset button to really get the story formed?
Well, I mean, I had already been thinking about Artemis for some time, and so I had already done a lot of the groundwork of the setting. But it's interesting. With Artemis, I made the entire setting before I did anything story related. I mean, I started off by like designing the city, figuring out figuring out the economics, figuring out how they built the city, figuring out, the kind of progression of the city through time so that it, as it grew, and all these details that only about 1% of which ends up in the book. But only then, when I was done with the setting, I'm like, all right, setting done. Now I need characters in a story. Because, world building is fun. It's the rest of the pesky writing process that isn't. So I came up with a story and characters and everything like that, presented it to my editor just in outline form. And my editor and my agent are like, well, that is not a very good story, but it's an awesome setting.
Right.
So I came up with a completely different story. Some characters were reused, other characters were ditched, a completely different story to take place, and presented that. And they're like, that's not very good either. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. And so in the first story, Jazz Bashara was a very, very tertiary character. She was only going to be in 2 or 3 scenes here and there. She wasn't remotely in the core main set of characters. In the second story, her role was expanded a bit, but still was not, she was very secondary, I would say. But after the second story idea wasn't that good, I thought, Jazz, this character here, this minor character, is actually pretty interesting. Why don't I look into making a story about her? And that turned out to be really cool. So it's kind of weird how Jazz evolved and kind of like pushed her way to the front to main character. It wasn't my idea to have like a female Saudi lead. I didn't sit down going like, I'm going to be inclusive. It was just, it just worked out that way. And
it's just who the character became.
Well, yeah, and the reason she was female in Saudi originally is like in the first rev, I'm like, oh, I need a likable smuggler type. What's a country I haven't used yet? I mean, because Artemis is very international. I'm like, what's a country I haven't used yet? Saudi Arabia, sure, and let's make her a woman just for the hell of it. And that was like the entire character definition of Jazz for the first book, right? But then I just kept refining and refining, and by the time I got to the third rev, which is what Artemis as it's printed is, and I will apologize for pounding if you hear that in the background. There's some construction going on downstairs.
It's all good. It's all
good. By the time I got I'm going to make this about Jazz, she was so cemented in my mind as who she was. She was female. She was Saudi descended. And I'm like, I would not have been able to change that to something I'm more comfortable with, like make her a guy or something like that, because my imagination would have rebelled. It would have been like, no, you've defined this character. You made your bed, So that's how I ended up with Jazz as a lead. I kind of meandered way the hell off your original question.
It's fine. It's fine. That's the way the show goes. We meander. And one question I have, Artemis is first off, the book is set on the moon, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And there's a colony, a city called Artemis. Is that right?
Yes, that is the only city on the moon. The only city that's not on Earth. It's mankind's first off Earth colonization.
Gotcha. Artemis, if I remember my Greek mythology, was the goddess of the moon, and some other things like maybe chastity, etc.
I don't know about chastity, maybe, but she was the goddess of the moon, and she's Apollo's twin sister. See what I did there?
Yeah,
and then she is also the goddess of the hunt.
Right.
She was a virginal goddess. She if anybody saw her naked, she would turn them into stags and then hunt them in the forest.
Like you do.
Like you do.
Right.
Yeah.
So okay. Well, I was wondering
she was
if there was
also probably in some versions she was Orion's lover. Although she's supposed to be, a virgin goddess too, but she might have been, a little bit sticky and still a virgin. It's like that's how the Greek mythology is very
right. Look the other way.
Yeah, right. It's like yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was wondering if there was some other subtext to the title, other than
I just think,
Goddess of the Moon.
By tradition, for whatever reason, we like to name major spacecraft after ancient mythological beings. So I thought, well, first off, the word itself is cool. It's just a neat word, Artemis. Yeah, it's neat. And it's she's associated with the moon, and she's Apollo's twin sister. So it seemed like a slam dunk to me.
Yeah, and it looks great scrawled across the top of the book.
Yeah.
So we've got Jazz Bashara, the main protagonist that the story is built around. How did you decide to create the setting? You talked about working on the setting first, but why the moon and why a sort of advanced city like this? What was your thinking in building this setting?
Well, really what I wanted to do was make a story about humanity's first off-Earth city. Like a city, not just like a base that's paid for by a government, but a functioning city where people are there of their own volition and not being paid by a central authority. A functional working economy outside of Earth. So I wanted to make that story. And I thought, okay, where's that going to be? Just try to be predictive. There were kind of three main candidates. Low Earth orbit is one option, because that's the closest. That takes the least amount of resources to get stuff to, right? And there's the moon, and then there's Mars. The thing is, Mars is monumentally further away than the moon. For reference, imagine you're standing at a goal line on a football field, and you're looking across to the other goal line, right? I want you to imagine Mars is at the other goal, okay? Well, the moon, at that scale, the moon would be 4 inches in front of you. So that's the difference. So colonizing Mars before we colonize the moon would be like if the ancient Britons colonized North America before they colonized Wales. It's just like it's ludicrous to do all the extra effort when there's something much closer and easier. The next thing I'm like, well, why the moon? Why not low Earth orbit? Well, the moon has tons and tons of resources on it. It's got ore and metal and everything you need to make a moon base, and low Earth orbit has literally nothing. So if you wanted to build a city in space in low Earth orbit, it would be you'd have to ship up every single gram that city ever uses. That would get expensive. But if you build a city on the moon, you just have to ship up the facilities to process the materials that are there. And so, I mean, I have no idea what the mass of Artemis is, but it's probably in the millions of tons range. You would not have wanted to ship all that to the moon. Whereas what they shipped instead was they shipped 2 reactors so that they'd have redundancy, a smelting facility and some harvesters so that they could collect lunar ore, which is just laying out on the surface because there's no dirt in the way, collect ore, smelt it to get the aluminum and oxygen out, which are unbelievably plentiful in the ores on the surface of the moon. And that's what they made the city out of, which is another really awesome thing about the moon. The most common mineral that you'll find in the lunar highlands, the highlands are the bumpy parts of the moon, the most common mineral you'll find is called anorthite, and anorthite is made of, among other things, aluminum and oxygen. So by smelting anorthite, you get aluminum to make your moon base and oxygen to fill it. So the moon is made of moon bases, just some assembly required. So it's really the perfect place. Then I had to come up with, why would anybody build a city there? Like, I've never bought into, like, some of the, a lot of science fiction will say, like, here's the reason there's a city on the moon. And oftentimes just some basic examination would be like, no, that doesn't make sense. It's like, oh, there's something we need there. Like, we're mining something, you know? I'm like, well, first off, whatever you're finding on the moon is probably a lot cheaper to mine on Earth. But let's ignore that. Let's say there is something really critical on the moon that you need to mine that you can't find on Earth. Well, then have robots do it. Why would you put a human population there? Robots are so much easier to keep alive, and nobody gets mad if they die. Right? So why would you have humans there? That makes no sense. And then other things are like, oh, well, Earth is overpopulated. I'm like, well, then colonize the Sahara or the ocean floor or Antarctica. I mean, literally every place on Earth is easier to colonize than literally any place on the moon.
Sure.
And then the other thing is like, oh, political pressure. People go there to escape tyranny or whatever. I'm like, well, first off, if you can get there, your oppressors can get there. And second off, that doesn't make any sense unless it's somehow economically viable. If you're like, oh, woe is me, I'm being religiously oppressed, I'll just spend $400 billion to go to the moon. I'm like, if you've got that kind of money, you ain't being oppressed. So what I came up with is there has to be any given city anywhere on Earth has an economic foundation, an economic base. There is a reason why that city exists. And in the cases where that economic foundation disappears, the city suffers horribly and eventually dies. So, you know, you've got like a factory town and the factory closes. Well, that town is ruined, right? So Artemis, I decided the answer is tourism. That's an explanation for why there has to be humans there, because the whole point is for humans to be there. And so I gave mankind like 50 years to drive the price to low Earth orbit down to something that middle class people can afford. I think that's a reasonable amount of time. And then that's when it became economically viable to build a city on the moon, because people would pay to go there. And so
it becomes like a Disney World vacation.
It's less the Disney World and more like a Caribbean resort, if you think about that. It's a resort town, definitely. I base their whole economy and the way the town works on that, on real world, like Caribbean and other, you know, tropical resort towns. What you get is really opulent hotels and then much more austere living conditions for the people who live and work there, you know, behind the hotels. And that's what Artemis is. It has the really high-end hotels and shops area in the Aldrin bubble, and then it has like a bunch of, you know, kind of hard living, somewhat hard living. It's not like they're slaves or anything, but it's, you know, rough living for the people who live there. I babbled for a long time on that. I hope you edit that down.
No, that's exactly what I hoped you would say. But the Martian was mostly a single character novel. There were other characters around, support characters, and of course you had all of the crew at NASA, and there's very important storylines there. But Mark Watney is really the book, and you did a masterful job of keeping us turning pages when we're mostly concerned about this one guy and really his interactions with himself. And that's a comment that you hear over and over about The Martian is that it's, the way that you handle the single character. In Artemis, where you've got a city that you built and it's a heist caper, which we'll talk about in just a second. But what was the difference when you're talking probably orders of magnitude of story to keep up with and threads to weave together? Kind of what was the process like in expanding out past really Mark Watney's eyeballs?
Yeah, that was much harder. I mean, it's still a first-person narration book, right? Artemis is still first-person smart-ass narration style, but
which we love.
Yeah, it's all I got. So I hope people like it. But
I'm detecting a pattern here, Andy.
Yeah. yeah, there's a lot more complexity, a whole bunch more characters, a lot of moving parts in Artemis. I mean, The Martian was just a really fancy sequence of math problems, and Artemis is much more like human motivations or driving things. And yeah, and I did that on purpose because I wanted to stretch myself as a writer. I mean, The Martian really is a one-trick pony. If I wrote another book that was very similar to The Martian, where it's somebody solving a series of complicated problems and stuff like that, people wouldn't enjoy it. They think they would, they think, oh yeah, no, I love The Martian, just make more of that. But they wouldn't, because they'd just be like, well, I've seen this. A lot of the reason The Martian did so well, I think, is because of novelty. And so it's not a pattern that I can just repeat. It's not like I wrote a really good mystery novel and now I can just keep cranking those out. I need to I need to expand and grow and do more complicated things as a writer, or I'm just going to be a one-trick pony and nobody likes the trick anymore.
Yeah, I get it. And of course, if you rewrote The Martian with a different setting and a different character, hardcore fans would come eat it up, but you wouldn't have that broad appeal that The Martian had.
Right. Also, The Martian managed to touch into things like all of humanity trying to band together to save this one guy, and it had a real feel-good message, and that was kind of accidental, but it worked out really well. And, it really, I just kind of like accidentally did everything right.
Right. Well, and you got all these great memes after the fact of, how much money have we spent saving Matt Damon?
Yeah. Well, actually, in the book, I address the money issue, because in the book, there's in a press conference, they say, like, why are we spending so much money to save one man? Like, we're spending like just hundreds of millions of dollars. How many people's lives could we have saved if we just dumped all that into like paying for people's medical care, on Earth?
Yeah.
And and Annie Montrose was is the the director of media relations, and she says, like, well, don't think of this as we're spending all this money to rescue one man. Just think of this as we spent like $100 billion to have 5 missions that put it was more than that, but we spent about $100 billion per mission to get just 31 days on Mars. Now, by throwing a few $100 million extra into it, we're getting 500 additional days on Mars. So in terms of research per dollar, we're getting, like, this is the best deal NASA's ever had.
Right. Talk a little bit about the heist caper and why that sort of story, and what was the challenge in setting a scenario like that off world.
Well, I've always loved heist stories, crime novels, that sort of thing, and so I figured, well, I mean, I've got a city, let's have some crime.
Because that will happen.
Yeah, of course it'll happen. Humans are what humans are. And so I said, like, well, I want a caper. And setting a caper in Artemis is actually considerably easier than making it happen in like Chicago or something like that, because Chicago has a large, very effective police force, and Artemis has like one guy. So Artemis really is a frontier town, and it has that, and it has all the advantages and disadvantages of a frontier town. So making it's kind of the perfect storm of things. There's, first off, pretty much no laws at all. It's like, it's just like, okay, if you're really bad, if you kill people or something like that, then we'll deport you to the victim's country for trial. That's it. That's all they got. So minimal laws, minimal law enforcement. There's this one guy named Rudy, right? And then huge amounts of money flying around, right? So it's like the perfect storm for crime. It's the perfect setup for organized crime and for just kind of white collar crime like money laundering and stuff like that. There's an awful lot of that. But anyway, the heist in the story is about a business on the moon that, the aforementioned collecting materials and turning them into usable metals and oxygen. somebody wants to take over that company, and so he hires Jazz to sabotage that company's stuff, and so that they'll have to sell it to him. It's more complicated than that, but yeah.
Well, one of the things that makes a heist work, Andy, is the threat of getting caught, and you're worried about the characters involved in the caper because they're always right on the edge of danger. Mm-hmm. So where Artemis is ripe for crime, how do you build tension in a place like that when you don't have a very present police force and so how do you build that tension?
Well, the main tension comes from the fact that if she does get caught, she'll be deported to the victim's country to stand trial, and so in this case, she's sabotaging a company that belongs to a Brazilian company, basically, and she would get deported to Brazil to stand trial. So there is that danger, but much more present is the danger of the people that she's messing with, which turns out to be I don't want to give too many spoilers, but just the company she messed with, she should not have messed with.
Gotcha. So even though there's not a very present law enforcement, there is another force there that that's putting the pressure on, shall we say?
Well, yeah. Who then they're not interested in arresting her for this,
right? That's not the problem.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
They are people who will keep in a room.
Oh man. So Artemis releases. We're recording this November 1st, and I think it comes out the middle of the month, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It comes up.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
It comes out November 14th, so just a little under 2 weeks from when we're recording this.
Excellent. Is there already some movie news about Artemis?
Well, yeah. I mean, so 20th Century Fox bought the film rights. That doesn't mean they're going to make a movie, but it does mean they now own the rights. They've lined up Chris Lord and Phil Miller, the directing duo, to direct, and that's kind of where we are right now. I think the next step would be for them to dig up a screenplay writer to do the adaptation, and presumably Lord and Miller will be looking for someone that they are either familiar with or know that they can work with well. But that's kind of that's what's going on right now. Hollywood is kind of random, and it's like really, really slow until it's incredibly mind-bogglingly fast, And so,
right.
My suspicion, although no one would actually say this to me, but my suspicion is they're just going to kick back and wait to see how well the book does. That's what I'd do.
Yeah, that's what I would do too.
I mean, before I sunk like $100 million into a movie, I'd want to know if people like the story.
Right. Well, my bet is they will, and
we'll see. A lot of stuff has to go right for a movie to get made. The Martian was just this charmed project from start to finish, like all the way through the book and the movie production. It's like it never goes that smoothly. And there are some really, really good books out there that have never gotten a movie made out of them, and it's so. I won't take it personally if it doesn't happen, but of course I would love for it to happen.
Well, you had The Martian, so many people cannot say that. Right now, I think people are going to love the book. And
I hope so.
I think that's, I hope we get movies based on books we love, but we have books, and sometimes the book is better. We get to sit with it for, if we really stretch it out, we could read it for a month, and
well, I don't want that to happen.
Well,
I don't want you to be able to put that down. I want you to be up at 3 a.m. cursing yourself, knowing that it's going to be a terrible day tomorrow because you didn't get enough sleep, but still unable to put it down. I want you to curse my name to 7 generations because I kept you up all night. That's what I want.
Well, I was talking about the third reread.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Yeah.
Fair enough. You want that. Andy, thank you so much for taking time to come back on the show. I'm going to send everybody to pick up the book. I know that everyone's going to love it. What is, So Artemis is done. It's in the bag. It's printed. There's no more working on Artemis. So what are you working on now?
Well, right now I'm taking it easy. I've got like 2 different book ideas, one of which is a sequel to Artemis, or less of a sequel, but more another book that takes place in the same setting. I would love for Artemis to be my personal sandbox where I can make all sorts of stories take place that aren't necessarily serial to each other. So think of it like Terry Pratchett's Discworld. I would love to have something like that. Because it just, for me, when authors do that, the setting just seems so real and so tangible that it really kind of enhances all of the books that take place in it. I would love for that to happen, but, I don't know how popular Artemis is going to be. So I also have another story that I haven't really written much on, but have worked on, done all the math on. And it's another hard science fiction story that would be in its own continuity. And, so I could do either one of those. So I'm hoping that Artemis hits well. I would love to write more books that take place there, but we'll see.
Excellent. Andy, we're going to send everybody to pick up Artemis, and good luck, brother. I hope you have continued success.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Jason yanked the coils of safety rope to one shoulder and heaved them out the attic window. The bundle bounced over the roofline and dropped to the yard below. He tightened the harness, making sure the shoulder straps were snug over his sweatshirt. He threaded his rope through the braking device, tested it, and clipped everything to the carabiner at his navel. So far, so good. Fireman Mike would be proud. His stomach flipped as he neared the octagonal window. Had he tied the correct knots? Would he get himself killed? Weeks had passed since Mike's tutorial but he had to attempt the break-in now, while both Van Brunts were at the Christmas Eve service. He swung his legs through the window and felt for the roof. His sneakers gripped the shingles and he wriggled out, grateful for once to have feet as big as snowshoes. He pulled on a ski mask and sang, "Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can." He lowered his body. Wind punched him in the jaw like a supervillain, surprising him. His sweatshirt rode up and snow burrowed into his navel. He looked down but couldn't see his feet. He relaxed his hands and put a few ounces of weight on the rope. Clots of snow broke away, dove over the edge, and took far too long to hit ground. He drew his rope around the pipe and pulled tight. Now he could drop. No, you will not drop. You will rappel. You will rappel very safely. He backed towards the edge, towards the point of no return. The backyard lurched into view. It was a 4-story fall, and he'd probably hit the stairs on the way down. He sledded helplessly. His legs fell, swung, and kicked the side of the house. Alarm bells went off in his head. He gripped the rope. It looked like nothing. A shoelace. "Jason Crane, you're a damn fool." He went limp and fell over. The rope gave a jolt, and the harness tried to castrate him. He twisted, trying to save his poor descendants. He began to spin. His arm bashed through a row of icicles. The spin slowed, reversed, and at last he came to a stop with his back to the house, dangling over the backyard. "Thank you, rope. That's a good rope. Well done." He tried to turn around, but couldn't. With patience, he worked out a method of kicking in circles and managed to press his sneakers to the side of the house. He needed slack. He gathered his loose rope to the small of his back and disengaged the brake. Zip! He fell fast, all his weight on the rope now. His feet, planted, shot up over his head. The brake caught him, and the rope vibrated as wildly as a guitar string striking a note of panic. Jason heard a crunching sound and looked up. The leaf gutter crumpled and poured a stream of bitter ice water into his eyes. He snarled and wiped his face, dripping humiliation. Jason rested a moment and stared at his reflection in the glass. He was an enormous Macy's balloon drifting over New Jersey, tethered at the navel like underdog. "How the hell did you get up here, kid?" He did an awkward split, one foot above the window and the other below, hanging sideways with his weight on one hip. He closed his eyes and reached for the sill, crouching against the side of the house. His fingernails found the weather stripping, and he tugged. Locked. He cursed and tugged again, anger rising. He grabbed the frame with both hands and pulled with all his spider strength. Something popped. The window rose and the curtains splashed out. Jason dove headfirst into the fabric, wriggled and kicked, let out some rope and fell with a whump into his archenemy's lair.